Hello, Pastor Heath Jones here of Northwood Christian Church. I hope this day finds you well. Before I get into the text and then the message, I should note that today is one of those days where I am recording in my office with the sound of children playing just outside. Our preschool is in session and they are playing outside, enjoying the weather in a socially distanced and safe way. So if their sounds distract you, I apologize in advance, but I hope that their laughter and their shouts of play actually in fact bring you some joy. So that being said, on with the text and then the message. And today's text is found in the Gospel of John chapter 14 verses 1 through 7, and it goes, reading from the Common English Bible. Don't be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me. My Father's house has room to spare. If that weren't the case, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? When I go to prepare a place for you, I will return and take you to be with me, so that where I am, you will be too. You know the way to the place I'm going. Thomas asked, Lord, we don't know where you are going. How can we know the way? Jesus answered, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you have really known me, you will also know the Father. From now on, you know him and have seen him. This week, we're continuing our discussion about currency. And if you've been following in previous weeks, you will know that by currency, I do not mean money. It can mean money, but it does not have to mean money and should not primarily mean money. And so we have been considering Eric Law's book called Holy Currencies. And in that book, he makes the case that there are different kinds of currencies. And for churches and communities to be healthy, those currencies must flow. They should not, cannot stagnate. And so he uses the word currency to describe any and all assets that a community might hold, and asks that we imagine what it might be like if we allowed these currencies to flow so they might be a blessing to others. And he makes the case repeatedly that if they do not flow, they stagnate and then they are eventually lost. So for example, last week we talked about the currency of relationships, about how a healthy community sits on a treasure trove of value in the relationships that they have with one another. The richness of those relationships cultivated in life-giving communities. And we talked about how the currency of relationships is foundational to life-giving community, and that we must deepen the relationships that we have and also cultivate new ones. So you can't put a price on the richness of such relationships, and this currency of life-giving relationships must flow before all others. So before you get to conversations about money, you need to know that you are in a community of persons who love and care for one another, because there's no other reason to support a community monetarily if it is not a life-giving place like that. And so the currency of relationships must flow. And so we encourage you to call your friends, your church family, your church members, and those who are part of whatever body of religious believers you congregate with, or any community that you're a part of, and to deepen those relationships and allow those currencies to flow and to bless others with your love and your compassion and your concern and your care. This week, I'd like to talk about a different currency, the currency of truth. And if you don't think truth is a currency, consider this. Truth is often bottled up. It is often kept from flowing and pushed underground. And the truth about ourselves and our relationships with one another and about the current reality of things is sometimes shrouded or hidden or kept at bay by a wall of cognitive dissonance. But the currency of truth absolutely has to flow. So this is going to be a message about what it might be like for us to discover this currency of truth, to tell the truth, speak the truth to one another, and then receive the truth. Because, as Jesus said, the truth will set us free. More on that later. But first, I'd like to say some things about the text that we're considering today. I spent some time reflecting on this passage and whether or not I had preached it outside of the context of a funeral. And I don't think that I ever have. I think this is the first time that I've preached this passage outside of the context of a funeral, because it's often requested at funerals, and the version that's usually read at funerals goes, in my Father's house there are many mansions. And I don't know if you missed it, but in the version that I just read from the Common English Bible, it reads, my Father's house has room to spare. which is, in fact, a more accurate picture of what is described here. You see, when the King James Bible translators rendered the Greek here, mansions, the word did not have the same meaning that it does today. It seems that people think that when we die, God will give each person their own private estate, this huge, big old house. And I guess in that situation, you just have to wave at your loved ones from afar. It seems to me more like a life of a movie star, separated, isolated from others. And I don't know about you, but this is not a very compelling idea to me. Isolated and apart from intimate human community, who needs all that space to themselves. But it turns out this whole discussion stems from a misunderstanding about the word sometimes translated as mansions. In the English, the Old English, the word here translated as mansions merely meant rooms. It could mean a very humble hovel or a hole in the ground or even a broom closet. It just meant room. And so in my Father's house, there are many rooms, or in this case, today's translation, room to spare. And the idea here is that in God's house, there are rooms for each of us, and we each have a space. And the rooms open up into this common area where we commune with God and with one another, this shared space where humanity is reconciled to one another and to God. So we're all living in the Father's house, in God's house, and we each have a space there. It's not a place of isolation where we each have our own big old house, but we all live in a house like an intimate family. And I love this idea that the end vision for where humanity is going is this shared space where we eat from a common table, perhaps, hint, hint, that's what our communion points to. In fact, that is what our communion points to, an intimate and close setting. And this will be a good thing because we will love one another deeply and will continue to fall in love and on and on and on and on and forever. But how will we arrive at this place is the question that might occur to you. And it turns out this was the first question that came into Thomas's mind. And in the Gospel of John, you know that Thomas is the doubting Thomas, the one with the questions. And he says, Lord, how will we know the way? And it's after this that Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you have already known me, verse 7, you will also know the Father. From now on, you know him and have seen him. And I realize that verse 6 has been used in the past as this doctrinal club, this divisive verse that pits one kind of human against another. I am the way, believer against disbelief, which, if you follow the trajectory of Jesus' ministry, is ironic because Jesus frequently surrounded himself with doubters. And so this idea that those who believe the wrong way are outside and those who believe the right way are inside, and that's the litmus test, it just doesn't seem to fit with Jesus' ministry, who included people with loads of questions who didn't always buy in all at once. And it turns out Jesus seemed fairly comfortable communing with those who weren't quite sure how to peg him. So it's a real tragedy in my estimation that we've allowed this verse to be used as a line in the sand kind of verse. This, as I said, litmus test. It's been utilized as like this true or false type of quiz question. No one comes to the Father unless you believe like I do. But in fact, this is not what the verse really says. Before we attempt to determine who's in and who's out, which we shouldn't be doing anyway, because only God knows the human heart, we should focus first on what is here meant by way, where it is we are heading, and what sort of life or philosophy or way of seeing things, perspective, leads to life. This path, what does that way look like? And the way is embodied by the life and actions of Jesus. He models the way. He embodies the way. And this is far more profound than agreeing to a set of beliefs about Christianity. To actually embody a way of being rather than signing up for a description of God on paper and signing off on that as if that's your mental agreement with those claims was what saved your soul in the end. It's rather about seeing the way Jesus represents and seeing that it is a far better way, and then walking with him along that way. It's a lifestyle. So the solution is emphatically not get your beliefs about God right on paper. The solution is to walk the path as Jesus walked. So instead of saying, get your thoughts about God in order, we should be saying, feed the poor like Jesus did. Then you will better understand God the Father. Seek out the destitute and the outcast like Jesus did. Then you will better understand the heart of God. Really live like the last will be first and the first will be last. And then you will know God better than many who have mastered in theology. When Jesus describes the realm of God and contrasts it with the ways we now live, listen to him and walk the path of discipleship to that place. Walk like Jesus, talk like Jesus. This is the way to reconciliation, healing, and wholeness. So all this to say, Jesus embodies the way, but this passage should not be rendered as this hard true or false question on some divine quiz. Rather, it's an invitation for us all to walk along the path to healing and wholeness. This passage is inclusive and wide open to all. But where does the truth fit into all of this? As I said it from the onset, today we'll be talking about the currency of truth. And we miss, in all this discussion about way in life, that in between, we have the word truth. Truth sits between way and life. The way to life must pass through the truth. Before we find life, we must discover the truth, speak the truth, and name the hard truths about ourselves and our communities. Truth in church is something that is all too often bottled up. It is a currency that is kept from flowing because we are afraid. People do not name the unspoken secrets of the community. During Jesus' trial, he was asked by Pontius Pilate, what is the truth? It's a question that is almost scary, too scary to ask, because if the truth were known, what would we have to change about ourselves, our face, and ourselves? And when we can answer this question at church, we will know ourselves. And I really do believe that the truth can set us free. But the truth can be hard. I've spoken before of communities that do not talk to one another in an open or candid way because the truth is felt to be some kind of landmine that if it is set off, brought to the surface, if it is named, then the whole community will implode and lose its purpose, its direction, what have you. But can the community be said to be a real, life-giving, sustainable community if it is held together by covering the truth, not naming the truth, or worse, if it is held together by a lie or a form of self-deception or false perception of itself? Eric Law writes of this currency of truth. The currency of truth is the ability to articulate individually and corporately the global and holistic truth internally, the experiences of the different individuals and groups within the church or ministry, and externally, the experiences of different individuals and groups in the community, the neighborhood, the city or town, the nation, and the earth. Developing our currency of truth requires that we have the ability to recognize processes that are incomplete, partial, and divisive, and replace them with holistic, truth-seeking processes from debate mode to dialogue mode, from premature judgment to clarification before judgment, from convincing to mutual understanding, from my truth versus your truth to shared truth, from mono perspective to multiple perspectives, from either or to both and, from sinner or saint to thinking we are all sinners and saints, from who is right to what is right, from accepting the viewpoint of the powerful to raising up the voices of the powerless, from standing in the center to circling around the margin, from divisive solutions to community-owned resolution, from denigrating differences to being curious about differences, and from targeting the other as the evil one to naming the unjust system. When we are able to make this adjustment in designing every event, meeting, and gathering, the people with whom we have contact will learn and experience consistently the truth-seeking way, and our community will live a life that is guided by the spirit of truth in everything that we do. So, as he said, it starts internally. Who are we? Who are we? When churches get together to write down what their mission is, they're trying to discover who they are and what they are about. And it's hard to pin down, especially if the currency of relationships, as was discussed last week, has not been flowing in a healthy way. So what are we not saying about ourselves in our current reality? What are we able to name about ourselves in our current reality? What truths are spoken and left unspoken? Whose voices have been marginalized within the community? Perhaps somebody who sits in the back of the church, voiceless, year after year after year. Eric Law suggests that churches host truth events. Truth events. That sounds a bit intimidating. These are events at which the members of a church come together and hard truths or joyful truths, just truth, is named. And I just have to say, it all sounds like a recipe for disaster, doesn't it? It doesn't have to be, though, if the currency of truth has already been flowing. It will be difficult at first, but once it gets flowing, people learn that these are not going to be conversations that pit one another against one another, but conversations where deep empathy and understanding is the goal. Well, then the truth can begin to flow. Can be tricky, but necessary, nevertheless. So I realize this is a lot, and it will be challenging, especially if naming the truth has blown up in our faces in the past. We can be a bit gun-shy or wary of the truth. Or it can be like a hard counseling session, one in which an unpleasant truth about ourselves is named, one we've been hiding from for years, and I speak from experience. And while it is hard to hear such truths, the naming of the truth is the first step on the path to freedom. So I imagine what this might look like here at Northwood, at our church. How if we came together and spoke honestly about who we are, what we are doing, and what we hope to become, about our past, our present, and what we hope for the future. And if this idea scares you, don't worry, it scares me too. Do I want to know the truth? What insecurities or inadequacies will it call up from my depths? And believe me, I have insecurities and perceived inadequacies that I bury and am unwilling to face sometimes. If naming what is primarily wrong in the community is all that it means to tell the truth, to air the laundry, just to blurt out negative things, if that's all it means to tell the truth, then I'm not sure the truth event will be a very productive use of our time. Turns out, it's not just that, it's both. You name the hard truths, but then you name the positive truths. You acknowledge the wonderful things about your church, in your church community, what you love about it, what is right about it, and ways that that can be nurtured and spread around so it might be a blessing to others. So not an inquisition, but rather a path to discovery. And it would go like this. You would name one. You would name an issue or ministry Northwood is struggling with. And during this pandemic, we are struggling with so many. It is hard to have church when you are apart. It's beginning to wonder if it's possible, So what to do with this? How did we get here? What is the history of how we came to this place? And how does it inform the present? The narrative must not be dominated by a few voices. It cannot just be the pastor pontificating or a few vocal members of the congregation sharing their strong opinions. Rather, all perspectives must be encouraged and shared. So, 2, name the present state of things bluntly and truthfully. What is currently not working? How are decisions being made? What is working quite well, and how can we fan that flame? And then 3, what voices are not being considered? What voices are being left out of the conversation during the pandemic? It's those voices who are not able to join us in these digital spaces. So how can we connect those voices at something like a truth event? We need to bring these voices to the table. Then lastly, what answers do we have in-house to address the truth? What ideas are generating in the community? What deeper understanding might we come to so that the truth becomes something that flows and leads to life, rather than something we hide from, unspoken truths that fade and are never brought to light? By the way, we are going to do this. Elders and church leaders, start thinking about the truths that you need to name. We're going to have to do this together, of course, and it's time for the currency of truth to flow. The very thought has me at once excited about the potentials and the possibilities, but also anxious. This process has already begun through phone conversations with lay leaders as we've discussed candidly the current state of things and the ways in which our current practices are just not adequate to meet the needs of not only our congregants, but those who we hope to minister to in the community. But we cannot hide from this. No sturdy house is built on half-truths or cover-ups. And so by the grace of God, we can do this and we can name these truths. And so over the course of the next weeks and months, we hope to discover more about what is true of ourselves. But it does not stop there. It cannot just be an in-house discussion. Alongside internal dialogue, writes Eric Law, this internal dialogue about the truth should be a dialogue about the situation between the church and the community at large. And so this external dialogue where we bring other voices into the mix and we listen. Can a church that claims to be walking the way of Jesus ignore the brokenness that is just outside its doors? Can it ignore those voices? And I think that churches behave a lot like I do when I leave a restaurant as it relates to facing the truth of what is just outside. Let me explain. I leave a restaurant, leftovers in hand, and then I see a homeless or hungry person right outside. Maybe this is downtown Indianapolis, and I see somebody who I must walk past before I get to my car. And I could either acknowledge the truth of his reality and the systemic failures in our society that he signifies, or I can practice some form of cognitive dissonance or mental gymnastics so that I can walk past him with my leftovers in hand and a clean conscience. On one hand, to acknowledge the truth of his presence on the sidewalk in front of me is to name so much more about what's wrong with the world and our country and our culture and our cities and our communities. So sometimes I just smile weakly and I walk on by. It's as much as I feel I can do in terms of my energy and efforts because I'm worn out by the world sometimes. And that smile is my tacit acknowledgement of his humanity. But all things considered, I've forgotten him by the time that I've gotten to my car. In other words, I've ignored the truth. And churches behave like this all the time. Our church sits a mile away from entrenched poverty and mere blocks away from collective despair and disillusionment. I've spoken to neighbors of Northwood, both rich and poor, who have named to me deep spiritual scarcity in their lives or physical scarcities in their lives. Loneliness, apathy, sadness, depression, addiction, and sometimes physical hunger and economic insecurity, which is exacerbated in this time of pandemic and economic hardship. So churches must expand this conversation about truth, to name the truth about their own context, meaning the community in which that physical church location sits. Not to increase our own sadness or anxieties, but to face the questions that must be faced. Questions that must be named, truths that must be named on this path, on this way to life. As we walk with Jesus, as he is the way through the truth and on to life. And it's scary, I know. It'll call us to change and to action and to creative solutions and to discomfort, which is exactly the point. Remember, this whole discussion about getting currencies flowing so that they might produce more life is about that very thing. Getting the currencies flowing so that they might produce more life, which means we've got to get moving. The currency of truth, when bottled up, leads us to nowhere and a slow and steady decay, as many churches are experiencing. But the currency of truth, when it flows, leads us to challenging places, but to the very growth we claim that we want to see. So what is the truth as you see it? What do you need to name and to say into the community? Think about it. You will find opportunities to do just this. Northwood is going to create opportunities to do just this. Some of it will be phone calls. Some of it will be actual truth events hosted in safe ways in these trying times. But remember, it's a two-way street. So start preparing yourself to listen, to withhold judgment so that you can arrive at a better understanding of another's truth, another's perspective, as they name what is true. The way of Jesus leads us through truth to life, but first, truth. And what is truth? In the coming year, I hope we will discover it together. Surely, the truth will set us free.